Hello and welcome to the Small Business Briefing. My name is Brian Calley with the CEO of the Small Business Association of Michigan.
Hi, everyone. Sarah Miller, Vice President of Marketing and Strategic Communications. Thank you for joining us today. I want to welcome one of our new members, Swank Builders, located in Goodrich. And we're welcoming this new member on behalf of our sponsor, Consumers Credit Union. Did you know that Consumers Credit Union offers terms up to 20 years with no balloon payments on real estate business loans? You can learn more at consumerscu.org. All right, so let's get started with an update on the income tax situation. Governor Whitmer gave a press conference this morning. What did she share?
I watched the press conference this morning, and I've had a few follow-up conversations as well as trying to understand what's going to be in the bill and what's not in the bill. You might recall, our members will recall last week that there was a proposed substitute for a tax bill last week that we didn't like it at all. We had a call to action with our members and quite a response, over 1,000 responses in a single day. And I can tell you for sure it did make a difference. It really the brakes were put on the activities last week, and then late Friday some concepts were released, and then today a few more details. Although there's still a lot of stuff we don't quite know. So let's talk about what we do know. The earned income tax credit is going to be part. They've taken several concepts and they're putting them into one bill. So the earned income tax credit moving to 30% is one of the things that's in the bill. Now, this is something that SBAM has supported in the past. It is a tax credit that goes to lower income households. It's essentially a reward for work. There's some theory that it might draw more people into the workforce. And on the margins, it probably will make some difference, but it's what we like is the juxtaposition of social service help that is directly aimed at those who are working. So helping people that are in the workforce and maybe inspiring them to stay there. If you're not in the workforce, you don't qualify for this support. So it's a federal credit, already exists in the federal tax code. There's just a mechanism in Michigan where in the past you get, like in current law, whatever the federal credit is, you get to add 6% in your state tax return. That's going to be moved all the way up to 30% in this deal. So whatever your federal earned income tax credit is, an additional 30% is put on your state tax return. Now, one thing I want to make sure everybody understands, because all the press releases say you get a combined $3,150. You know, that's what an average family or what a family could get from this earned income tax credit. But that is not what you get from the state. That is the amount of your federal tax credit plus your state tax credit. This change in the law would be about a $600 or so change for the average Michigan family that qualifies for the earned income tax credit. So when you see this $3,000 number, understand that is not what is being added. That's taking the old amount that's in federal law and has been for the last 40 years. And saying and then adding that to the new part of the state tax credit. So in the state tax credit for an average family who qualifies for the credit, okay, so lower income families, $600 difference. So that's something that SBAM has long since supported, or supported for quite some time. The other items, retirement. Taxes on retirement income. So SBAM, one of the things that SBAM put out in our previous call to action was in a paper to the legislature was a request to treat all types of retirement the same. We didn't want to go back to a system that gave public pensions and private sector pensions favored treatment over 401ks, IRAs. And during the press conference, the governor said, well, we're going to equalize public and private sector pensions. Now, pension means something, right? I mean, pension is a type of retirement account, but in some follow-up conversations, it seems like they actually might be moving toward equalization of public, private sector pensions and IRAs and 401k distributions as well, to have an equal threshold for all of them. That'd be a big development. If I'm right about that, that's a big development. And it's in a change since the legislation was introduced a few weeks ago and what we understood it to be last week. So if in fact that is the case, a big positive move. But again, haven't seen actual legislation, haven't seen a draft. Really, these are conversations and quotes from a press conference. And then the new thing that was put on the table is what the media is calling a rebate check. I think the governor called it a inflation assistance check or something of that nature. And it's $180, and it's the same for everybody across the board. So it's for that would be for households, I believe. That was the word that the governor used this morning, was households. Now, I have seen much reporting since then that has said $180 per person, per taxpayer. That is, of course, very different. So the number that they're talking about is about $800 million in total money, one-time support that goes out. And so that's one of the kind of open questions out there is, are they talking about per person, per taxpayer, or is it per household? And was not clear, and I don't have a solid answer for you on it. So the big thing that is not, that we don't know is what they're going to do with respect to the income tax rollback that would be due to Michiganders based on the consensus revenue estimating conference. So there's a rollback that is in law. The rate is supposed to go from 4.25% down to 4.05% because state revenue has grown so much faster than inflation since last year. And it's not clear if there's anything in the legislation that would somewhat like de-trigger the rollback. There are a lot of statements by an attorney from Dykema, Dykema Gossett, which is a big law firm in Lansing, does a lot of work on legislation and legislative issues. And but this is Steve Liedel. Steve Liedel is somebody who had that was the transition manager, I believe, for Governor Whitmer, and also served in the Granholm administration in the second term, maybe the first term too. But I wasn't in town during the first term. I know in the second term, he was in the front office there for Governor Granholm. Steve Liedel is somebody that you really go to if you're looking for kind of, what are some intricacies in the law, and could we read this in a different way? And clearly, he's putting out there kind of into the in the political and legislative ecosystem some new legal theories that maybe the law that was passed that had the rollback was not constitutional, or maybe it's just a one-time thing and it rolls back, but it resets at the original rate. So he's kind of putting a bunch of new ideas out there, which tells me maybe they are not going to pursue a cancellation of the rollback in the legislation and instead do it in some administrative way. But again, not clear. So there's several things we know. There's a bunch of stuff we don't quite know yet. And unfortunately, until I get my hands on actual verbiage in legislation, I won't know. It will be going to what's called a conference committee. So this bill has been passed in different ways in the House and the Senate. It now goes to what's called a conference committee. There'd be 3 senators, and usually it's the same amount, 3 senators and 3 representatives, although I thought I saw maybe it was going to be 4 from the House. And I'm just realizing I never got back to asking the question. That would be highly unusual, but I did read that in one of the articles last week. But nevertheless, a conference report, a conference committee from the House and the Senate. And one of the reasons that on big and controversial issues that legislative leadership likes to use these conference committees is because if they pass something out of the conference committee, it goes to the House and the Senate and has to go for an up or down vote. There's no amendments that are allowed. It's like a procedural way to avoid the hassle, some cases embarrassment, of voting down politically popular amendments that they might not want to have to deal with. So all that to say, we learned some today. We have more to learn. There's a few things that depending on interpretation, could actually turn out okay. And there's others that we're still concerned about. So as soon as we know, we are committed to letting you know. We do not have a call to action for people today. We just don't know enough yet about the details to know whether or not there's anything seriously problematic, as we knew last week. Last week, I saw the substitute language for the bill. I was able to read it myself and I knew exactly what it did. That's why we did a call to action. In this case, well, they're being a little more careful with putting the drafts out there, and I haven't seen it yet. But if they intend to move it on Wednesday, which is what I kind of expect they'll do, then I think we'll probably be able to get our hands on it sometime tomorrow. And when we do, you'll know.
All right. Speaking of Wednesday, I think we're going to get the budget presentation Wednesday as well. And the administration has been making some strategic leaks as to what we might see in this next budget. So what do we know so far?
Well, two things. First, on some conversations that I've had with the administration, they did indicate that education would be a pretty big feature in the budget. And education, if you've been watching our briefings or go to our events over the last few months, this is one of the areas where we're really quite hopeful that we're going to be able to work closely with the administration on is moving forward on education. It really wasn't featured much in the state of the state, but I expect it will be in the budget that is presented on Wednesday. Now, what would normally happen is that as you lead up to it, an administration will pick a couple popular things that they want to make sure don't get kind of lost in all the noise of the entire budget presentation, put them out early. That started early this morning. There was an exclusive, if you will, that was given to the Detroit Free Press about some aspects of education that included, the big one is a tutoring initiative, so about a $300 million allocation to just make resources available for tutoring for kids that are behind. This is really, I think, the first like substantive answer or direction of resources toward the way that kids are falling back. So our kids have been underperforming the nation for a while, but throughout the pandemic, we actually relatively fell back a lot more than the rest of the country, and bottom 10 state in many ways in education. Is the most critical aspect to our future workforce is the current state of education. And this allocation for tutoring would be like one-on-one tutoring would be something that I expect is really directly aimed at trying to help kids catch up from the learning loss that they had over the last couple of years. There was actually a $90 million proposal for summer school to support more summer school options for kids as well. Our culture in America, but especially here in Michigan, is that summer school is not often utilized. And but whether or not parents are willing to consider a change or having their kids go to summer school, if they're as behind as many of them are, then maybe the willingness to do that has changed, but it looks like some resources are going to be dedicated to that. And then $42 million for literacy coaches, and that's it's another one of those areas where the literacy level of children at their earlier ages is a pretty big indicator of how well they're going to do with academics later on. There's kind of an old saying, it says you go from reading to learn learning to read to reading to learn. So that's making sure that you get past the learning to read part and to be quite proficient at it is a key to the rest of education. So literacy coaches would be aimed straight at that. Those are the bigger items that were in that exclusive this morning. I do expect that we'll probably hear a lot more about education. There are a lot of things. I mean, resources is one of the things that is needed in education, but it really is only one of the things. There's several aspects to bringing the education system back that will be necessary, including governance, transparency, accountability, around the system itself, in addition to resources and specialized resources for the populations that are furthest behind. And so the kind of first leak, if you will, of the budget presentation would suggest that education is in fact going to be a centerpiece of the budget.
And we'll certainly cover more about that budget presentation on Thursday's briefing. All right, so Governor Whitmer actually signed an executive directive today regarding MISTA. What does that directive do?
Yeah, and this one actually, Sarah, was an executive order. So she also did an executive directive on Friday, which was for disadvantaged businesses in disadvantaged geographies, to make sure that they get that the state government creates more opportunities for state contracts. That has to do with just how a state department is operating. The executive order from today, which I happen to be present for, I was at the Grand Rapids Economic Club where the governor was, and I don't know if it was announced ahead of time. If it was, I missed it, that she was signing this executive order, but it's a reorganization of how a part of state government works, and it's where the resources for some housing, in particular community development block grant dollars. Right now, they go through the strategic fund, and it looks like they're going to put them over in MISTA. I haven't read the whole executive order yet. It was just a little while ago that she signed it, and the idea of moving it over to moving the community development block grants over to MISTA. Actually, I think could prove to be a pretty smart move, to the extent that MISTA's got some new leadership, some new energy, seems to be very engaged with bringing in stakeholders. We have a long-term history at SBAM with MISTA, a very, very positive one, and there's some brand new leadership, Amy Hovey, that seems to be going out of her way to engage with stakeholders. And we really appreciate that. Same thing, like on Friday, I was in a work group with the Unemployment Insurance Agency department, as they're kind of rethinking the system and program design and the dynamics around it. And they brought a bunch of stakeholders in to talk through these potential changes and setting up a process for that stakeholder engagement. That's really the way to do it. And so the fact that these dollars are moving to a department and a process that we have a long-term history of working closely with seems real positive on first impression.
Well, that's great. Let's talk again about SOAR. So this acronym has kind of been floating around lately. So let us know, Brian, what does SOAR stand for, and does SBAM have any position?
Yeah, this has come up a couple of times. Actually, last week it was a really key part of our opposition in the previous legislation, which was money that was permanently dedicated to the SOAR fund, and it kind of de-triggered the rollback of the rate reduction, the tax cut that small businesses were going to get. And SOAR stands for Strategic Outreach and Attraction Reserve. So it's where money goes in to attract like big business. So General Motors put in a new battery plant, one in Orion Township and one in Delta Township in Oakland County and Eaton County. And the SOAR fund was used to give them incentives to do that. It was like $667 million, I think. These are big dollars. SOAR has had, since it was created in I think it was the end of 2020. SOAR has had about $1.8 billion put into it. And it was the subject of the tax policy last week, but it was also something that has been part of budget discussions as well. And I expect it probably will be something that we hear about on Wednesday. There are a couple of projects that I think the MEDC is ready to move on. They'd like to award some incentives and announce them, but they need more resources appropriated to the fund. So the question of, does SBAM have a position on SOAR? We don't. We actually have never taken a position for or against this type of economic development. Is not for small businesses. There is some argument. People say, well, some benefit, trickle down, if you will, benefit to small businesses when these big projects happen, supply chain and traffic and so forth. And there might be some truth to that, but there's a but our position has really been, or we have not taken a position on it until or unless SOAR is used at the expense of small business. And that's where the difference was last week. Last week, it was taking away something from small business in order to give to big business. Of course, we oppose that. If they separate these things out and they put SOAR back into the budget process, or maybe it's in the tax code somewhere, but not at the expense of small business, then that's it's a different matter. So it's not something that in that case that we would support, but it's not something that we would oppose either.
All right, well, thanks for the clarification there. Last month, you shared some population insight on the briefing, and now there's some new outbound migration numbers and census data that we have.
I thought it would be worth sharing with you, since the Census Bureau, every year they update numbers and they're always putting out new estimates. And Michigan has, since the year 2020, we have lost about 43,000 residents to other states. Doesn't mean our population is different. Like we're talking about here, outbound migration. This isn't, there are a lot of factors, births and deaths and things that impact overall population. But in terms of people from Michigan that move to other places, since 2020, we've lost about 43,000 people to other states. Just for kind of comparison's sake, or to what does that mean? How many people is this? About like the population of Saginaw. And the biggest gainer of, of course, people went all over from Michigan, but the biggest gainer was Florida in that outbound migration. So I think probably in the Midwest, there's several states where, to the extent that they lost people, that it was more to Florida than any other state. Florida has really been on quite a boom when it comes to their population and the increases that they've seen. I think about 1,000 people a day for the last 10 years is what the net increase that they've been experiencing. And some of those are for Michigan. But let's keep it in context. In the first decade of this century, so 2000, 2001 through 2010, when our state was in a free fall, we were actually losing about 50,000 plus per year. And in this case is, so over the course of a few years, 43,000, it's bad. You don't want to see it. But we definitely have lost more faster in the past. So, but this is, again, this is the place, this is the top issue. This is the main thing that we need our policymakers to focus on. We have low labor force participation rate, and we have declining population, and births are less than deaths, and outbound migration. So these things kind of stack up on each other, and it's just not going to be enough people. That's why I always say that, inflation is a big problem now. There's reason to believe that it's by the end of this year, it's going to be well under control. But there's no reason to believe by the end of this year that our labor force participation and overall population trends will be any better. In fact, there's reason to believe they'll be worse. So this is definitely the area that we need chief and top focus on.
All right, we're about to get into Data Monday, and I think we're going to start with the topic we haven't really had to talk much about on the briefing lately, which is COVID. And generally speaking, there's some new data that's showing that COVID has been mild this winter.
Yeah, it's the origins of the small business briefing were updates on COVID, everything happening with COVID. And in this case, while we've kind of moved away and there hasn't been a lot of stuff to cover on this, I thought it was worth noting that that this winter compared to the last two winters has been quite mild. That shouldn't be a surprise, but if you look at January of 22, see this peak? Look at January of 21, see that peak? And then here's January of 23. So there definitely the numbers did go up, but everything went up. There were with the flu and just kind of the regular seasonal stuff, and it really does. COVID seems to have kind of joined those others, and our population kind of behaving similarly in to the seasonal activity that otherwise happens in the state. So this is really what population immunity looks like, and so the numbers were lower, and there's also reason to believe that the overall severity of the cases that were there were also lower, again because of population immunity. Let's get in now to some of the economic data. We covered the Federal Reserve meeting last week, and we see ADP's national employment report, and the total non-farm payroll is actually up a little bit, and this is actually and you can see here the total with this blue line, so really made up the pandemic gap there. And but if you look at this kind of month over month number, you see it's smaller and kind of trending generally downward in terms of the changes in employment, but still positive. So in other words, what this is showing is that there's gains still, but the gains are smaller. And it's hard to know if this is exactly what the Federal Reserve wants to see or not. I mean, I think generally they want things to slow but not go negative. Although I think they are still kind of concerned that there's not enough pressure being taken off prices because of the labor market. Now, the labor force participation rate, we have it here for men and women, but also for the total. So if you look at that top line, the orange line, you'll see the labor force participation rate for men down a little bit for, and then if you look at women, which is the purple on the bottom, which has traditionally been about 10% lower than the labor force participation rate of men, actually up a little bit, and then you see the total in the middle, which was, I would say it's been pretty stable for the last, this is the nationwide numbers, by the way, not Michigan's, pretty stable for the last several months. So not a lot of change there. Looking at the unemployment rate, you'll see that it's at 3.4%. So again, back to pre-pandemic levels, and while there is some concern about, I think everybody's expecting a softer economy here in the next year. The fact that there are, in Michigan, for example, 10 open jobs for every 6 people looking for it, you can lose jobs without unemployment going up, and so that is it's really the main reason why I think that this, to the extent we have a recession, it will feel very different. One area, though, that is definitely, we're definitely seeing a downward trend is in the new orders and with manufacturers. So up 4%, so still up, not in negative territory yet, but it's down. I mean, it's the rate of increase is declining, and there's actually pretty good reason to believe that this could go into negative territory. So this is one of those areas that seems to be cooling off, and it makes sense, right? We saw housing cool off first. Now new orders in manufacturing, this would include a lot of durable goods, the sort of things that people borrow money to buy, and that is affected by interest rates. So this is another area, and this is another reason why I think that we're that inflation will get under control, is because that we saw it in housing first, which is exactly where you'd expect to see it. Now showing up in manufacturing, and then in terms of hourly wages, the percentage change, we see that kind of trending toward a more normal-ish territory. The over 5, I know because they've brought it up many times, the Federal Reserve was really quite concerned about year-over-year increases being over 5%, even getting up as high as 6, actually spiked much higher than that. in the beginning of the pandemic. But this is an indication again that things are cooling off, but still pretty hot. I mean, if you look historically, 4.4% year-over-year growth is quite strong compared to previous years. And coming out of the Great Recession, there was a pretty decent upward trend. Again, these are national numbers, not Michigan numbers. But if you were to take out the highs and the lows of the pandemic spikes, and just look at this trend line and where it is at the moment, it's actually not too far off. So that's but I think this is an area that there's a lot of focus on and trying to get that back into more normal territory. So that's the Data Monday for today. And overall, there's a lot to keep track of. And I'm honored that we have a membership that looks to us to keep them informed, and very, very thankful that when we call you into action, that you respond. And I can tell you absolutely for sure that last week when you did, it made a difference. And while we're still waiting for details, I know that at least some of our concerns will have been addressed, and then it's our job in the meantime to try to get as close as we can to our small business agenda. And I'll look forward to giving you another update on Thursday.
All right. Thanks everyone for joining us today. If you're in the Lansing area tomorrow, to join us at our owner to owner event. If you're going to be in Marquette next week, we're going to be there on the 16th. So visit sbam.org/events for details on those. We also have a webinar coming up this Wednesday on inflation. So please tune into that as well. Again, you can find all of that and more at sbam.org for events. Thank you to Consumers Credit Union for your sponsorship. Thanks for tuning in. And like Brian said, we'll be back here Thursday at 3 p.m.
Yeah, Thursday.